Thank you very much, Linda, for that wonderful welcome. And I wasn't editing student work, I was editing my own work at the last minute. So, thank you very much for coming along today. And I'm going to speak, as the title says up there, Learning to Play from the Recordings of 19th Century Masters, New Perspectives on the Study of Historical Performance. I'd like to start off by reading you an excerpt from Richard TARUSKIN's text and act. Richard TARUSKIN is a famous musicologist, an American musicologist who took part in quite a heated debate in the later part of the 20th century about historical performance and early music and period performance in general, and came up with some really interesting ideas. And this one is something that I'm going to be focusing on today. They, the earliest sound recordings, are instantly recognizable as pre-modern. To hear them is to realize how far we've traveled from that phase of history. They show how fundamentally akin to modern performance practices are those that claim to be historical. The old recordings utterly debunk that pharisaical claim, for recordings are the hardest evidence of performance practice imaginable. If we truly wanted to perform historically, we would begin by imitating early 20th century recordings of late 19th century music and extrapolate back from there. What TARUSKIN talked about said a cat amongst the pigeons, and there's been continuing debate about it, and some people were very angry about what he was proposing here. The advent of sound recording in the late 19th century brought with it the possibility of preserving for posterity the art of famous musicians. Acoustic rack cylinder and disc recordings, player, piano or roll recordings, and eventually electrical recordings from the early 1920s changed the way music was heard, and in turn contributed to an unprecedentedly rapid change in playing style and aesthetic in the first decades of the 20th century. This change shaped the modernist style of the mid to late 20th century, with its insistence on fidelity to the literal meaning of the musical notation. In other words, a face value interpretation of the notation. Those who remain skeptical that there was such a dramatic change choose to ignore the hard evidence documented in recordings made throughout the 20th century. And there are many people who just refuse to believe that there was such a dramatic change. In early recordings in musical style by Robert Phillip, he clearly highlights this change. If you wanted to read his book, he goes through the first 30 years of the 20th century talking about what happens in recordings. So how do we define modern performance practice? When I was studying the piano at Sydney University back in the early 1980s, I was advised always to seek out, as far as possible, urtexts, or editions that had not been tampered with or corrupted by an editor, and to follow the composer's markings explicitly without adding too much in the way of microdynamics, rhythmic or tempo changes. Adding ornaments to Baroque period music from, say, Monteverdi to Bach was sanctioned because the treatises by C.P. Bach, Quantz and Leopold Mozart gave us permission to do so. In retrospect, I was allowed few liberties other than, say, a slight reduction in tempo at cadence points, particularly in classical and romantic period music. In Evenings with Horowitz, published in 1992, pianist David Duval is derogatory of the very straitjacketing effect of this modernist attitude. Modern performance practice, he explains, has held the composer's score sacred. A more academic point of view has prevailed in our conformist world. Trusting the letter of the score has too often passed for respect for the composer. This and the deadly perfection of recording have helped to homogenize musical interpretation, producing a blandness which threatens musical life and alienates many young performers from the spirit of the music. I've enlarged the key words and phrases here that I think are important. I hope you can see those. Clean, crisp, and highly accurate performances became the hallmarks of successful interpretation in the late 20th century. Worse still, we expected to hear our favourite work in a live concert or competition as interpreted by the famous artist on the recording, which we had listened to over and over again. I even used to do that with pop music. I remember listening to Kate Bush, who was a favourite singer of mine, and knew her songs back to front. and went to her concert when she came to Sydney, and I was so disappointed. It was completely different, and thought, that's not the piece I knew. Go away. The work and the interpretation becomes synonymous, and any departure from that was vexing. By contrast, in the 19th century and earlier, the notation was understood to be a starting point, to which much had to be added to give life and spirit to the interpretation. The earliest recordings demonstrate that late Romantic style was characterized by a palette of expressive tools that promoted a more individual interpretation with respect particularly to rhythm and tempo, contributing to an improvised feeling in performance. The late Bruce Haynes makes very clear distinctions between late Romantic style and modern style in his very wonderful book, The End of Early Music. He says, if Romantic protocol was heavy, personal, organic, free, spontaneous, impulsive, irregular, disorganized and inexact, modern style is the reverse. Light, impersonal, mechanical, literal, correct, deliberate, consistent, metronomic, and regular. Modernists look for discipline and line, while they disparage Romantic performance for its excessive rubato, its bluster, its self-indulgent posturing, and its sentimentality. Scholars generally agree that by 1950, modern performance practice was firmly established, many of the expressive practices of the late Romantic era expunged. But we are now experiencing a gradual shift in attitude and style, inspired in part by the efforts of the historically informed performance movement, or HIP movement as we call it these days, that grew in stature and gained particular prominence, supported by the recording industry in the last 3 decades of the 20th century, but also by the rediscovery and growing interest in old recordings, and the efforts of several performing scholars who are, after careful study, are adopting and promoting those very practices that were expunged. For several hardened performing practice detectives like me, the exciting thing about the advent of recording is that it preserved the playing of various significant musicians belonging to a generation who were trained in the mid-19th century. The list includes Karl Reinecke, born in 1824, Joseph Joachim, Johannes Brahms, Theodore Leschetizky, Camille Saint-Saëns, Adelina Patti, and Vladimir de Pachmann, just to name a very few. There were many others. And then you get the next generation who were born around the 1850s and 60s, who also trained during the 19th century, and so it goes on. In 1900, the style of these players was already considered by budding modernists to be old-fashioned and outdated. But the fact is that their recordings provide hard evidence of what constituted highly artistic performance as far back as the 1830s and 1840s. Now that takes us back practically to the end of the Beethoven-Schubert era. Given that stylistic changes would almost certainly have been slower than in the 20th century, we might also assume that some of their playing style was not only familiar to Beethoven and Schubert, but also preserved remnants of late 18th century practices by musicians such as Mozart and Haydn. It is interesting to ponder then that when Karl Reinecke, who was born in 1824, while Beethoven and Schubert were still alive, was embarking on his musical studies, there were still people alive who had heard Mozart and Haydn, and even perhaps J.S. Bach, at first hand, and could relate their playing styles to younger generations. It is, of course, impossible to know with certainty what musical performances sounded like before the recording era. By the traditional method of performing practice study, examining information preserved in written texts, pedagogical writings, letters, reminiscences, scores, reviews, and documents like that, we can at the very least gain some understanding of the types of practices that existed. But the written words and the musical notation will not reveal vital information, the exact quality and quantity of practices that shaped interpretations. As my colleague at Huddersfield University, the performing scholar David Milsom, quite rightly points out, in an ephemeral art such as music, in which so much vital information must be heard to be understood, and indeed seen and experienced in context to be appreciated, we have to concede ultimately that we know very little of the act of performance itself before the invention of the recording medium. A fundamental issue is that it is extremely difficult to describe in words the exact features of a performance. This is abundantly clear when we have a chance to compare written description with actual performance or oral examples. I'm going to give you just 2 or 3 examples from my own research in my published book, Off the Record. The first is one that I use a lot, and for those of you who've heard it many times, I do apologize, but it's a great example. The first one is the pianist Leschetizky's teaching assistant, Malwina Gray. She was responsible for teaching all the young students and preparing them for them to advance into his class, gave rules promoted by Leschetizky himself for the dislocation of melody notes from the accompaniment. And what I mean is leaving the melody note till after the accompaniment note has sounded for expressive effects. She says, neither should bass tone and melody note always be taken precisely together, but the melody note may be struck an instant after the bass, which gives it more relief and a softer effect. However, this can be done only at the beginning of a phrase, and usually only on important notes and strong beats. It is better for the hands to coincide precisely on weak beats. The melody note must follow so swiftly as to make the pause hardly noticeable for the uninitiated. So there are several things that are important in this extract. She tries to tell the reader where one might use dislocation and the effect of it. And then also, importantly, she says that the pause between melody and bass should be hardly noticeable, as if if you'd never heard it done before, you wouldn't think there was anything different. But her explanation, including an annotated example which we see up here from Chopin's Nocturne, Opus 27, number 3, falls quite short of the interpretation of the same work that Leschetizky recorded onto piano roll in 1905. And we can compare this with his own edition of the work, which he put out. It was one of his favorite works, his concert work. So it's great to be able to hear him play and follow his own edition of the work. So let's listen to that right now. So I think you'll agree, just listening to that Leschetizky uses dislocation in the most extraordinary way compared with anything we hear nowadays of this work. The very first note, for example, in the second bar, the melody note is delayed so much that you can't, it's like the sledgehammer's hit you, really. So what she meant by hardly noticeable takes on a different meaning altogether. And that's a point that I talk about in my book a lot. When someone in the 19th century or the 18th century says, don't do this too much or do it very little, we have absolutely no idea what they meant by that, because it could be something completely different to a 20th century, 21st century meaning for that word. And you'll also notice that wherever there's a kind of fioratura or a group of notes or an ornamental passage, he tends to dislocate all of those notes. And that kind of contravenes what she's mentioned. So the point here is that if we followed her words kind of exactly, we'd come up with something that was plausible, but it wouldn't really approach the style of Leschetizky. And this is a problem when we go back in time to periods where we don't have oral examples. I'll move on to another example. Another issue is that although the descriptive terminology or musical signs and symbols used today outwardly resemble those of bygone eras, their meaning has evolved over time, and in some cases quite drastically. For example, Philip Corey explained in 1810 that, quote, when the words con espressioni, con anima, or dolce, etc., are marked at a passage, it signifies that the appoggiando, which is the old word for arpeggio, must be particularly and often used and made as long as possible. By saying as long as possible, he probably meant something like as slow as possible or to fill in the space somehow. But the most important thing here is that when we find words like con espressioni, con anima, which means with life or with animation, and dolce, which is a very beautiful effect, a sweet effect where you change the sound into a magical sound, I suppose, that arpeggiation of the material, the chords, is what you would use. And these terms absolutely do not signify that in modern performance today. So that meaning has been lost. While the Paris Conservatoire pianist Louis Adam showed in 1804 in his treatise for his students how portato articulation or slurred staccato could indicate delay of the melody note for expressive effect. You can see there the top line is the portato notation, and in the middle line he's notated it so that the notes are constantly delayed. And in 1827, the pianist Ignaz Moscheles recommended chords marked with the same portato marking to be arpeggiated. So this is in his Opus 70 studies, published in 1827, and you see the top line, portato chords. The second line he's showing you by breaking the notes up. Whether he meant this to be only in his studies or whether it was something more general is something to talk about. In some early recordings, we do hear pianists actually breaking their chords when you find portato chords. So it could have been a practice that was done by people throughout the 19th century. And no matter how detailed the score appears to be, it is doubtful that a literal face value reading of it, or as DURAL puts it, trusting the letter of the score, will result in an interpretation that resembles the original performance ideals. Those of you who've heard this example, I do apologize, but it's the best one I can find. Karl Reineke's performance of his own arrangement of the slow movement, the larghetto, from Mozart's Concerto K537, compared with his edition of the arrangement, highlights an improvisational quality not captured in the score. This quality was highly valued practice in the pre-modern era. So we'll just hear this page of it, and I just want to point out before we listen that it's so improvisational that although he published it like this, he starts at the very top. When he gets to the end of the second last bar in the second line, he jumps down to the end of the fourth line there, and then the music keeps going, and then he comes back and he jumps back. So he didn't play it in the order that he published it, is what I'm trying to say. But you'll also notice that he's adding an enormous amount of this. I'll just point out that, for example, arpeggio signs, the squiggly lines, appear in the third line, generally where chords are too big to be played together, but sometimes not, and they don't appear anywhere else. So let's have a listen to this. clearly, if we were to follow that score with our 21st century understanding of reading notes, we really wouldn't come up with anything approaching that. The thing that's fascinating for me, and I keep thinking about it over and over again, is that Karl Reinecker, born in 1824, did most of his study in the 1830s and 40s. He was very well loved by musicians such as Mendelssohn, Schumann, and Liszt, very well respected, and taught, literally hundreds of pianists in the 19th century. He's playing Mozart here. He was hailed as upholding the classical tradition of piano playing, and he loved playing Mozart. Is it possible that what we hear in his performance is actually how Mozart might have understood or wanted his music to be played? It's quite possible, but we're so used to hearing text-literal performances of Mozart where hardly anything departs from the page, that perhaps we've got it completely wrong. I just leave that, and people will have strong opinions about that, but this is really hard evidence here. So no matter how meticulously we extract and apply performing practice information from written sources and scores, the sonic result is involuntarily shaped by our own performance aesthetic, to borrow the words of Baroque trumpeter David Kjaer. He goes on to explain that, quote, due to the desire to create a compelling performance, the findings fit comfortably within the interpreter's performance ideal. Under these circumstances, it is improbable to render a personally offensive interpretation. And what he's saying here is that although performing practice scholars have read in detail the texts and applying the information, quite often there's a kind of selective application. They'll do what they can within the boundaries of the tastes that we're used to, but anything that goes beyond that or might cause concern is either not used or watered down in some way, made more palatable. So that's an issue if we're trying to be historical in our performance. So, having given you a bit of background, I'd like now to return to TARUSKIN's words that, quote, if we truly wanted to perform historically, we would begin by imitating early 20th century recordings of late 19th century music and extrapolate back from there. For it is this very process that is starting to be introduced into the performing practice research arena, as well as the pedagogical approaches of a handful of institutions around the world, including here at the SCM. I was a member of the organising committee for the symposium that happened in July just recently, entitled Performing Brahms in the 21st Century, which was hosted by the Music School at Leeds University. This brought together scholars, students and professional musicians from around the globe to share knowledge and experiences of Brahmsian performing practice. Amongst the presentations were some that dealt with the process of emulation, or as they like to call it, embodiment, of old recordings as a first stage in learning to play in historical style. I'm not going to use the word embodiment again today because having done a little bit of reading myself, and I'm not an expert at it, it's fraught. There's embodiments used in a lot of other disciplines to mean all sorts of things. I think what is meant here is getting used to playing like the recordings and making it your own. But I'll just call it emulation. The process is quite simple, but one that takes great commitment, patience, and ability to be self-critical. One starts by choosing a recording by one of the 19th century masters to serve as a model for learning how to play like the master. The master's recording is your teacher, in other words. After very careful scrutiny and analysis of the interpretation, which will include marking up the score with copious directions and repeated listening, one learns to play more or less exactly like the recording, imitating the interpretation slavishly. All aspects of the interpretation are adopted, followed as if the master is telling you what to do. This is also supported by in-depth study of performing practice information in contemporaneous texts, so that the student is as fully immersed, doesn't need to be a student, it could be me, fully immersed as possible in the style, both from the viewpoint of feeling what it is like physically to play the practices, to make them sound as close to the recording as possible, and theoretically to understand the history and function of the practices. The emulation process is continued until the style feels internalized and, so to speak, natural, at which point the student starts to branch out, to apply the new knowledge and experience to works for which there are no recorded examples or models. The process of emulation has been the focus of practice-led PhDs at the University of Leeds and at the Bern University of the Arts for a few years now. And at this conference that we were at, people from both those institutions, students and lecturers, presented on this process of emulation, which they've been doing for a while. It was really fascinating. One of the presentations at the symposium was by Leeds PhD student Jung-Yoon Cho, in which she focused on her recorded emulations of old recordings, which very much impressed the delegates. Knowing that I was going to be giving this presentation today, I gained Jung-Yoon's permission to play some extracts from her recordings to illustrate this new pedagogical approach. So I'll just talk a little bit about these slides. I hope everyone can see them clearly. I'm going to play you two excerpts now, one by Joachim himself playing his own Romance in C, which he recorded in 1903 onto wax. And the two examples are the same music, but they're annotated by my former PhD student, Robin Wilson, who did work in this area. And on the left-hand side, you've got an example which uses lines to show where Joachim inserts portamento, or audible sliding, which was a very expressive effect used by German violinists of the mid to late 19th century. So all those lines going up and down are portamento shifts, and you can follow that one. If you want to follow the other one on the right-hand side, Robin's marked in where, with squiggly lines, where vibrato occurs in the performance. So I'm going to go back to my notes to explain this. So you'll notice, if you follow the wiggly line vibrato one, that Joachim applies vibrato quite selectively, not on every single note, but on certain notes for expressive effect. And the vibrato has a fast and narrow quality like a quiver, compared with modern vibrato, which is wider, slower, and consequently more rich in sound. Some people might say to me, oh, can you hear through the hiss and crackle of the old recording what type of vibrato he uses? And the answer to that is that we actually can use spectrogram analysis, which is taking information from the wax and giving you a readout, which is really very exacting and shows the amplitude of the vibrato used. So there's science behind this, and it's very strong. The style of vibrato you'll hear characterized 19th century German style from the time of Louis Spohr's Violonschule, or his violin treatise of 1832, right through to the time of Joachim's last students in the early 19th century. Apart from those aspects, you'll also notice that Joachim is very flexible with both rhythm and tempo. This is his own piece, but the notes come out sounding quite different at times to how it looks on the page. So let's have a listen to Joachim playing. So you get a flavour for the almost improvisational character of the playing in terms of rhythm and tempo, but also how different that sounds to violin playing nowadays. So let's compare that with Jung-Yoon's recorded emulation of the same piece. You can follow the score. You can follow the vibrato part if you want to this time. I won't say anything about that right now. One thing to explain is, of course, I guess if Jung-Yun was going to follow exactly, she would have been playing on gut strings, which is what Joachim was playing on. She's a modern violinist, so she was playing on metal strings. But apart from that, I find that where she did her portamento, where the vibrato was, and the quality of it does, for me, having listened to Joachim's recording, capture that spirit really quite closely. I'm going to give you another example of her playing. Jung-Yun also emulated a performance by Joachim's arguably favourite student, Marie Soldat-Roger, of the second movement. Now of the second movement, the Adagio from Spohr's Violin Concerto No. 9, Opus 55, which she made in 1926. Many people who heard Soldat playing said that if you'd heard Joachim, then Soldat sounded exactly the same. She really emulated her master very closely. And Joachim really loved working with her. They played very much in the same style. I want to play you this example because in Spohr's violin school, he annotated the places where portamento and vibrato ought to be used in this piece, providing strong written evidence of such practices in the 1830s, and giving us an idea of the places and even the type of vibrato that should be used. He talks about the different vibratos. It's significant that almost 100 years later, Soldat applied both practices in almost exactly the same places recommended by Spohr. Let's have a listen to her playing first of all. So you'll hear similarities, definitely similarities between Soldat's playing and Joachim's style. Let's listen to Jung-Yun's performance now. I think that Jungyun's efforts here are very convincing. She's emulated both Joachim and Soldat's style very closely, and she's in the first year, at the end of the first year of her practice-led PhD. From this point, she will start to work on pieces that weren't recorded and to take the experience, the physical and the ideas, the reasoning for using these practices that you've heard into music where we don't have recordings. So it's really fascinating. The third stage will be when that's completely part of her style to make some professional recordings which will go out for examination. I've started to introduce emulation of old recordings as a pedagogical approach in the historical performance unit at the SCM. And I've invited one of our honours students, Anton Bredow, to share with you his first experience of the emulation process. So Anton, would you like to comment on this? I think he's very nervous about this, but it's great. He's a great guinea pig. Anton, could you tell us about your honours research topic and how emulation has featured in it?
My honours research topic this year is on the Viennese musical tradition and Chopin's place within that. So, as part of my research, I did a practical component, which is taking recordings. I took 2 recordings of pianists trained in the Viennese school, Parkman and Grunfeld, and I emulated these recordings in the hope of understanding better what they were doing, why they were doing it, and potentially where I could apply these practices in the future to other pieces where we don't have recordings.
Okay, and so we've had a chat about this and listed the stages that Anton's gone through. So I've transcribed what he said. He starts with careful and repeated listening of the recording, even down to bar by bar analysis, just listening over and over again to individual bars, notating the practices, so using all sorts of maybe dotted line notation, arrows to show forward movement, backward movement, that type of thing, so that you're seeing the sort of changes in the music. Learning the first bar until happy before moving on to the second bar, so really doggedly going at it. Recording oneself playing a section and then comparing it with the original, so constant reflecting back and forth. And playing along with the recording. I hadn't realised that he'd been doing this. It must be quite difficult when sometimes the pitches aren't quite the same. So, and today we were having a little go at it as well, and one of the things I remembered was both of us listening to the recording and then Anton playing, and me being able to point out, oh, there's something that you could think about, the movement's going faster there. So that's kind of the process. When I first proposed the idea of emulation to Anton, he didn't like the idea very much. Do you want to speak to that?
Well, Neal proposed the idea to me because for my mid-semester exam in my honours, I had to perform a 25-minute solo recital, and Neal said, why don't you choose 2 recordings and work from there? And I thought it was almost like musical plagiarism. I didn't want to take someone else's ideas and almost present them in my exam. And I was a bit uncomfortable with that. And I actually didn't realize at that stage that there was this second stage of this process, where the first stage is where you emulate it exactly, and the second stage is where you subconsciously understand what is happening and why it's happening, and therefore you make your own decisions in the piece, and it becomes your own interpretation in that style. And I had no idea about this, so I went ahead with it. I wasn't too happy about it, but then when I realized that I was, getting into this second stage, I was very surprised and very happy, and it was, a good point.
Yeah. So after discussion about all this, so you can see that he was worried about playing Pachman's piece exactly the same way and had no inkling that the process would help mold his own interpretation by helping to develop his skills and confidence with using the practices that he previously really not known. And we came up with a definition maybe that emulating old recordings is about learning how it feels physically and mentally to adopt practices that are new or foreign and to develop a keen sense of taste for the quality and quantity of those practices. So Anton, now it's over to you. Would you mind demonstrating how you emulated Pachmann's interpretations? While you go over there, we're just going to listen to the actual recording that he emulated. And you can follow along with the score. We're just going to do a couple of lines of this. Live performance of that.
Pressure's on.
I'm glad that I didn't have to do that. He's a very brave man. And of course, you'll hear certain slight differences that actually, I was amazed this afternoon when we were working on it again to think he has actually copied very closely what Pachmann did. So over the semester, Anton started to employ dislocation, chordal arpeggiation, rhythmic alterations such as dotting, and that was a special feature of Pachmann's playing, and tempo modification in ways he had never tried before. And he started to become okay with it all. Eventually, he came into a lesson and exclaimed, "Neal, my dislocation is finally coming together." So there was a turning point in the emulation process, and he'd learned to emulate Pachmann pretty well. He then moved into the next stage of the process in which he started to play the same nocturne, retaining the flavour of Pachmann's style, but playing more in his own way as he felt it. And I think when he did his last recital, that's the way he presented it in his own style. Anton tried to play the nocturne as he did previously, before he'd been introduced to this, and he said to me that he found it extremely difficult.
So, out of interest for myself, I actually sat down and I wanted to play the nocturne as I would have played, as a modern pianist would have just played this nocturne, i.e. everything together. And I just couldn't do it. I was concentrating really hard for 3 bars. I got 3 bars done, and then I started thinking about the music, and I started dislocating again. I had to concentrate on every single note and make sure it was together, because it almost got to the point where it was natural for me, when I was thinking about the music, to dislocate. And that was a really interesting point.
So we're running out of time, so I'm going to finish up with a little bit more playing. In the second semester of his honours year, and he's just at the end of it now, Anton has been working on Chopin's Piano Concerto No. 1, Opus 11, for his forthcoming recital. This is a work for which there are no old recordings to emulate. So Anton has entered a third stage in the process by applying his practical experience of 19th century practices to this concerto. He wanted particularly to demonstrate what he's come up with for the second subject. It's a beautiful con espressione subject from the first movement. So over to you. Thank you very much, Anton. Anton has only been doing this for 6 to 8 months and claims that the practices are happening more and more unconsciously and feeling natural. So the answer to the question I've got up here is, I think that with time all of these things can be made to be natural. So I'll conclude now by saying that during the 20th century, departures from the score were increasingly seen as unwarranted violations of the composer's intentions. But this attitude directly contravened the age-old principle expressed by respected musicians such as Joseph Joachim, that reading between the lines of the score was essential to convey the composer's conception to the listener. Sound recordings of musicians trained in the middle decades of the 19th century, in conjunction with written evidence, clearly reveal a much more flexible approach to the notation. As David Kjaer points out, with the old recordings, we face the cold hard facts unearthed from a time capsule. By studying closely and emulating the performances of old-timers, we can gain a clear understanding and experience of the sound world of 100 to 150 years ago, than by reconstructing the style from information in written texts alone. From this we can start to speculate about pre-recorded eras, to imagine how performing practice evidence in written texts might actually have sounded, and to read between the lines of the notation. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you both very much. A fantastic laying out of the evidence and some wonderful examples. Thank you so much. So we've got some time for questions, but before we go on to the questions, can I just make a couple of brief announcements? Our next About Music talk will be the last for this year. It's in 2 weeks' time, so there's no lecture next week on the 19th, but come back on the 26th for the last lecture of the year, which will be delivered by Michael Halliwell, who's a very well-known member of the staff here at Sydney Conservatorium of Music. The other announcement is that, for those of you who haven't been here before, following the lecture there are complimentary refreshments which you'll find to the left when you exit the hall. And finally, just let me say that I'm hoping that by the time we all reconvene here on the 26th, we'll be able to make some announcements about the About Music series for next year, so for 2016, and I hope that will whet your appetites for the following year's research talks. You want to say something? You're first up with a question.
I want to ask a question.
Yes.
So first of all, thanks both of you. It's fascinating always to listen to this. It's like a window into the past, and I'm wondering what the next step is. How can you get that next step further back?
Yeah.
When the recordings run out, you take us back to the beginning of 1800s maybe, or even very late 1700s, and what can we do? Any suggestions?
Well, I didn't have time to do that today. I did want to do it, but for example, I was talking to Rick Cohn about this at lunchtime. We've got some fascinating things like the last castrato who recorded around 1900. And people listen to those recordings, and it's like, you know, some people think it's like listening to someone's voice being grated. He's old when he records, but he does these extraordinary leaping graces. It's like a yodel almost. Yo, yo. And he sings like this. And if you read the sleeve notes of the recording of the release, it says, oh, you know, he's technically terrible. He lost his technique, etc., etc. But then, if you go back to around 1700, when Corrie puts out his, a little bit later than that, his singing preceptor, which we have in the library here, you'll find this table of ornaments, which is highlighted, and it has these leaping graces. And so rather than thinking that what he was doing was some technical aberration, or that he was infirm and old and couldn't do it, if you actually compare the two things, it's quite clear that what we're hearing 100 years later is something that had been documented 100 years earlier. So there's remnants there. And it's great to have that. Whether it sounds exactly the same, we won't know, but it certainly spurs your imagination to think that these unusual ornaments, which we do not hear in singing nowadays, people don't add this to music of that period, was something that was really important. So the point about saying that is, we can use recordings, and we can sometimes identify practices that are still going on, and that's a great window. But beyond that, I think we have to be really careful about how we interpret written information. And whereas, you know, in the 70s and 80s, when the historically informed performance movement were becoming so celebrated with their recordings of Mozart symphonies and Beethoven, and then even going on to Schumann and Wagner, etc., and they were selling it as authentic performances simply because they were picking up period-style instruments. They were reading the texts at face value and actually interpreting the words in a very modernist way. It's what TARUSKIN talks about. And I think that's incredibly dangerous, particularly if you're going to be selling it as historical. It's nothing more than modernist, actually. So we've got to sort of examine the texts again and ask a million questions about what it actually could mean, and even go for some pretty outlandish, by our standards, performances. And also read the text and read the unusual bits in the text and ask, why is this being written about? You know, if they're writing about it, is it because too much of it's happening or too little of it's happening? And ask those sorts of questions rather than sort of just going for a literal interpretation. And that's all we can do.
So essentially you're going to read the text in the same way as you're reading the music. So what the text says may be quite different.
Yeah. I think, but the main thing is to keep questioning, and also not fall into the thing of just saying, oh, I've come up with my interpretation now, because for pre-recorded eras, we just don't know. So we may as well try all sorts of different things out within certain parameters, if you know what I mean, or push the boundaries.
I think that's very good advice for anybody dealing with any sorts of texts. I've actually got a question at the back first,
yes.
And then you're next.
David.
No, at the back, and then you'll be next.
Thanks, Neal. The argument that you make about the fact that this respect for the work and for the text of the work has led to a lot of these practices falling out, I'm sure it's right in its main point. However, if we consider, say, the mid-century pianists, those who are being sort of accused of being quite slavish, we still see that they employ bravado to some extent.
Oh, yes.
So therefore, it's not just a blanket, it's not in the text, we don't do it.
Yeah.
So, I mean, when I listen to the blanket, again, of course, not being of this persuasion, I think it's dreadful. And that's because of matter of taste, and obviously I can be educated or re-educated. What is it about the breaking of the hands that proved to be less desirable, whereas rubato seems to continue to be used?
Yeah. Let's talk about the rubato aspect. It's definitely, I didn't say that they didn't use rubato. I think the type of rubato, the extent of its use, the quality of it, and even the quantity of it was what became lessened or expunged. And yes, so they mid-20th century pianists still use rubato, and I certainly used it when I was studying as well, but nothing like what we hear on these old recordings. What was it about arpeggiation, for example, that I think it's simply that with, around the turn of the 20th century, when there was this move towards sort of the excesses. They didn't want the excesses of what they saw as the excesses of the Romantic period. You have Stravinsky, etc., and you have people saying, play what's in my text, when even they themselves couldn't do it. When they made recordings, they departed from the text. But there's this sort of, what do we call it, a snowballing effect of people jumping on the bandwagon and saying, okay, yes, we mustn't add too much to the music. And also, it's a time when you get to hear yourself in recordings. And people, this is documented really well, people like Joel Moore, for example, listened to his own recordings and over a period of time was shocked at what he was adding. And therefore, then the next recording, he took it out. Well, that's what he said he did. And so you get recordings themselves causing a rapid change in style. So it's just, as you say, it's a taste thing. For Reinecke, that was a normal way of playing, quite clearly, because all of his recordings have that style in it. But by the 1920s and 30s, that just seemed like an oddity, and so people wouldn't do it. I don't know if that really answers the question, but it's not really about right and wrong. It's just simply saying that the style had changed and it accelerated in the first 30 years of the 20th century. Would you like to ask me something? Yeah.
Okay, don't forget that there will be some occasion for quizzing Neal more aggressively afterwards. We have time for one more question. Thank you.
Yes, fine.
I'm just wondering if it would be easier to emulate the historical pieces if one immersed oneself in the literature of the time. That's one question. And it seemed to me that the violin music was more difficult for me to relate to because there was a bittersweet quality which seemed sentimental.
Yeah.
But I found the piano playing far more appealing, far more beautiful than contemporary versions, and I'd love to know where to get them.
Oh, yeah. I'll answer that question first. You can find everything on YouTube. You just have to, it's all there. Whereas 10 years ago we used to have to trawl the CD shops to find it and write to companies. It's all there. Our students have access to all that information. From a violin point of view, what you said, I think people do find it tricky, because if you listen to Joachim and Soldat, one of the problems with the recording medium itself is that it only recorded a certain wavelength. It didn't record the full spectrum as we now have in electrical recordings. And therefore, for example, notes can sound tinny, and they can sound weak, and they can sound even sharp. Sometimes the playing sounds on the sharp side, and it's because we're not getting the full sonic picture. And so people will say, oh, I'm just not convinced. And the other thing is that people just hate portamento. I mean, I know David doesn't like portamento, but it just depends. I think if you had a chance to listen more and more to these recordings and listen to them in their full, you get used to it somehow. I mean, I listened to Reinecke and I was absolutely shocked by his playing at first. And within about 10 listenings, I was sold, and now, it's just normal. So give it a bit more time, and you might change. And reading literature, reading widely, is always important. Put yourself into the feeling of the time. It helps a great deal, I think. Yes.
Well, I think we must draw this fascinating discussion to a close. So thank you very much, Neal,
Thank you
for
for having me.
a wonderful presentation. Also, thank you to Untitled Chapter.